Dajiao Kumsta, my name is Victor, and in today's video we're going to be talking about frame rates. Well, if you're wondering what frame rate to use, this video will answer that question for you. Let's start off with a simple tip. So to get a cinematic and natural looking image, your shutter speed should be following the 180-degree rule. So whatever your frame rate, your shutter speed should double it. For example, if you're shooting 24 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1/48 of a second, or with mirrorless cameras, we have to use 1/50th because we don't have 1/40th of a second on our shutter speed. So we'll just round up. And similarly, you're gonna follow this rule in the other frame rates. So let's start with 24 frames per second. 24 frames per second is what you should use if you're shooting in real time, just like this talking head. I'm not slowing down any footage, so I'm going to shoot 24 frames per second footage to edit into my 24 frame per second timeline. Usually, if you're shooting anything and you're not slowing down, you just set your camera to 24 frames per second. Start the shoot with that, finish the shoot with that. Normally, 30 frames per second is for broadcasts, what you see on TV and what you see on live streams as well, because it has more of this like live look. So one hack that I want to tell you guys with 30 frames per second is actually using it on a 24 frame per second timeline, because if you use 30 frames per second and you slow it down 80%, that fits the 24 frames per second timeline, and it'll just subtly slow down the footage. So if you're shooting portraits or fashion films or anything that you want kind of dreamy look, shoot 30 frames per second footage and slow it down to 80% so that it can fit into a 24 frame per second timeline, and it'll look majestic. It's not really slow-mo, but it's just a little lively, like a dream-like footage. Okay, let's get into 60 frames per second. Anything that's fast moving, maybe you're running and you want to slow it down, you use 60 frames per second. And the reason why is because sometimes this is way too overused, especially in wedding videography. They try to shoot everything in 60 frames per second, and I get it. I've done weddings before and it's very stressful. If you're on a commercial shoot, usually you plan out your shots. If you're using 60 frames per second on a 24 frame per second timeline, what's gonna happen is that it's just gonna be choppy. It won't be as natural as shooting 24 frames per second. So if you want that natural looking motion blur, you'd have to stretch that 60 frames per second footage into your 24 frame per second timeline. And that's about 40%, and that's gonna give you a slow-mo. So anything that you wanna slow down that's fast moving for sports, action sports, you shoot 60 frames per second. Anything that you want to highlight, maybe a basketball dunk, or maybe you're trying to capture a skateboard trick. Again, use 60 frames per second to really emphasize on this thing. And it's best used for big moments in your video. Okay, what about 120 frames per second? Well, this is something for speed ramping. I love shooting 120 frames per second for speed ramping. It gives me a super solid speed ramp if I'm doing a social video. Now, I heavily relied on this before, but again, only for social media work. When I turned into events and also weddings, it was quite slow for me. Like if I fit this in a 24 frame per second timeline, I have to slow it down to 20%. And that is super slow. For any action, for human action, you barely can't tell. You have to wait like 3 seconds to figure out what they're doing. Like if they're just walking, that walk will be like this. And it's not pleasing. Use this sparingly to high action scenes. If you're shooting some drift scenes, this could be the frame rate for you. Oftentimes, 120 frames is overused for beginners because it's something that they don't see a lot. And a lot of the times, like, oh, it's so cool. You can see the water splashing. You can see the guy just slowing down while he's running. If you want to emphasize like natural elements like fire, water, waves, mist, anything that you can capture in slow motion, 120 frames per second is the go-to. And that is it for the frame rates. So to sum up, Use 24 frames per second for everything real time, 30 frames for dreamy-like footage, 60 frames for those big moments and fast movements, and 120 frames for elements or something that you can't really capture with the naked eye. Like super fast-paced action, like a very fast skateboard trick or a drift race. If you guys have any more questions about frame rates, feel free to comment down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.
너와 나